I'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. I'm very excited to introduce today's presenter to you. Brian Rosenberg, the CEO of TRG Consulting. He has over 20 years of experience helping companies select and implement key technologies such as ERP systems. Brian has been instrumental in the selection and implementation of ERP software for many of the largest healthcare providers in the country as a strategic advisor and change leader. He is certified in Six Sigma, Kaizen, and change management. At this time, your lines have been muted. Throughout the webinar, should you have any questions, please use the question and answer box to the right, and we'll do our best to answer each question during the Q&A period. Brian, thank you very much for presenting today, and please kick us off.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today. Certainly, just want to do presentations, feel free to ask questions as we're going. Go ahead and put them in the chat box. I might answer some of them as we go, and others I'll hold until the end, depending on whether or not there's something that I intend to cover during the presentation. Let me give a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing in the presentation today. So we're going to talk about ERP systems and about ERP specifically within the healthcare industry, and we'll talk about doing selection processes for ERP solutions. We'll talk about why you should complete a selection process, how you can go about structuring an ERP selection, looking at the RFP process and the best way to balance the level of effort with the desire to get the best possible results. Talk about what you should be looking for as you're getting demonstrations of software, facilitating that decision and negotiating the deal, and then ramping up the implementation. And overall, I've been involved in many ERP selections, as mentioned, for many different healthcare providers. And while every organization has somewhat some aspect of unique needs, there's very specific solutions out there that provide great benefits for healthcare organizations, and some that have been around for a long time, and some newer ones that are coming up. And choosing the right solution is really a crucial for your organization. Many of you have been through prior software implementations. Maybe you've recently done an EHR implementation, and going through the process of choosing an application is partly about choosing the best possible solution, and partly about engaging and energizing the staff to get behind that new solution. So let's start and talk a little bit about ERP, and ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. I think people don't think about that so much anymore. The ERP has come to represent, in a lot of ways, the back office functions within a healthcare organization. So the components of ERP, which may or may not be involved in your particular selection process, but typically come down to four major areas. First off, financials, so the core accounting solutions, then supply chain, and then human resources and talent management, which is the newer entry within the ERP space in the last 10 years or so. So the selection that your organization may be going through may involve one or more of these, but most of the implementations and the selections that I've been involved in involve all of them. And having all of these solutions on one system is a big benefit. I think, as you look at overall where the organizations are going with both ERP and EHR, what's happening is that IT departments are increasingly looking at reducing the number of different applications that they have to support and the number of different integrations that they have to support within the organization. That's part of what's been driving Epic implementations on the EHR side and Cerner implementations, and part of what's driving ERP implementations in the back office. Many organizations changed their ERP during the Y2K conversions, and are now looking at alternatives as they've been on that application for a long time, or maybe it's not fully meeting their needs. And as a result, there's been a spike in ERP selections, and I believe that will continue in the years to come as people look at alternatives to the current solutions. Another big driver of ERP solutions often is mergers and acquisitions, which is very common in our industry, which results in a organization having multiple different solutions and needing to replace all of them with one, or to standardize onto one solution. That's often a driver of these selections as well. So from a financial standpoint, just to kind of go through the scope about what could be involved in ERP, financial perspective involves obviously the general ledger, but other components, what you typically see being done out of the ERP include accounts payable. Some people consider accounts payable to be part of the supply chain, and I've actually encouraged that quite a bit as well because invoice matching is such a critical component of how accounts payable processes and involves a very tight interaction with purchasing. And I have seen accounts payables reporting in the supply chain at more and more organizations within the healthcare industry. But regardless of where it sits, in most ERP solutions, accounts payable is considered to be part of the finance solution. Financial reporting, which would include analytics tools and also include your general financial statements. Accounts receivable, which doesn't mean as much in our industry as it does in most others. Because of patient accounting, which you're probably doing out of your EHR, this is really used in healthcare more for maybe rents that you charge for and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a small component of your use of the application. But the ERP applications generally have very robust accounts receivable functionality designed to work for other industries. Treasury management, so managing all your bank accounts, managing your investments and your cash flow, so you can be producing cash flow statements and cash projections. And then asset management. And asset management is something that to explain a little bit more, that asset management means two different things. The financial aspect of asset management is managing the list of all of the assets that tie to our general ledger asset account, as well as the depreciation that we're charging against that. There is a separate concept of asset management, which has been generally behind the times in healthcare, but it is picking up and is becoming more common, which is managing actually all of your plant assets, the repairs and maintenance against them, to make sure that you track the locations of everything, which also is a part of an ERP solution. Though when you're looking at asset management, it's important to be clear as to which of those functions you're looking for, or if you're looking for both. There's other components as well. This isn't meant to necessarily be all-inclusive, but the high-level overview of what typically is involved in the financials modules. Key here is that with financials modules, integration is really essential. And it's one of the big benefits of an ERP solution is to have all the information feeding into your general ledger and have everything to be visible right from the general ledger screens using drill back functionality to be able to get at all the detail of those transactions and be able to drive cost improvements. Now, when you look at the human resources side, this gets into managing the employee files and the payroll. What you're looking at here is really for the traditional human resources functionality that's available in the ERP. Tracking time. Many people do use third-party solutions for time tracking. Kronos is certainly the industry leader in that space. So sometimes that is a different solution, though there is integrated time tracking in most of the ERP solutions out there, and that is an option. Managing benefits, which can be very complicated. When you look at payroll, there's a lot of unique aspects of healthcare when you get into shift differentials and swing shifts and other things that can drive very unique and complicated needs in payroll that you want to make sure that your solution is able to support. You've got leave planning, FMLA, and absence management, and then scheduling of your workforce as all components of what could be a part of your ERP solution. And as we're looking at all of these components, considering that maybe all of them don't apply in your particular organization, and maybe you have third-party tools for some of them, but these are all components of what the ERP solutions are able to offer to a healthcare organization. Next, looking at talent management, which is really the next level of human resources interaction. But these solutions are newer in the industry. They're still heavily evolving. And as opposed to being focused on the transactional nature of managing the human resources department, they're focused more on identifying and improving the quality of talent within the organization. So you get into things like succession planning, getting into recruiting, and often these solutions will have interaction to be able to post jobs, to be able to track applicants, and help to identify the best possible applicants based on the parameters you establish. Compensation management, to do benchmarking, to do comparisons within your organization, to determine where you might be out of alignment with industry norms, tracking goals so you can set goals for your employees, and then performance management around that. So this area is one that is not as commonly and fully implemented across all healthcare organizations, but a lot of where focus has been in the last few years in improving the reach of the ERP applications and being able to get more value out of them. And then we get into supply chain, which is an often overlooked area of ERP, but I think really essential to healthcare and to optimizing the cash flow of organizations, because this tracks everything about how you're spending the money in the organization and all the inventory control. So the traditional aspects of purchasing, issuing purchase orders, tracking inventory in the warehouses that you have, getting into the sourcing. So sourcing functionality typically would involve allowing you to be able to put out an RFP or an RFI and be able to get responses, to be able to compare those responses and determine what the best prices are, and then import those prices back into your system with the vendor you selected. Managing of contracts is a part of that. So that can include the storing and referenceability of those contracts, but it also common need in healthcare is to be able to allow for not only a three-way match, but a true four-way match, which would include matching the invoice to the purchase order, to the receipt, and to the contract to make sure you're paying what you negotiated. Because it doesn't matter if you negotiate great contracts if that's not what you pay off of. And then general supplier management, to be able to manage who you're doing business with and allow them to be able to have a portal where they can make changes themselves so that you don't have to maintain all of that information. They can change their own addresses, their own bank account information, etc. So this is just a quick flyby look about what may be components of an ERP solution. But what you think about as you're looking at this is what components do you have today that you're replacing? What components would you consider using, you might need? What is important to you and to your organization as you're comparing and looking at the functionality that's available within the applications that you'll be exploring? So with that, let's talk a little bit about who's out there in our healthcare space. And when you look at here on the left, basically you're looking at the four major players that are involved in most of the software selections. Lawson, or now it's called Infor. So Infor purchased Lawson about 7 or 8 years ago, and they effectively have rebranded the Lawson product, but still most people in the industry know it and refer to it as Lawson. I've actually had been involved in my first Lawson implementation back in 1999 as part of a Y2K project. And it is the largest player in the healthcare space. PeopleSoft is an Oracle product now. Oracle bought PeopleSoft. But Oracle actually has another product called Fusion that they are deploying, which is their cloud product. So generally what you see is PeopleSoft as the on-premise solution and Fusion as the cloud solution, which is not as commonly implemented yet, but is a key component of the future Oracle strategy. So both of those are potential solutions that are both provided by Oracle. And then Workday has really made a big splash in the HR and financials area, and is currently getting into the supply chain side of it. They're not as commonly implemented in healthcare as the other solutions, but they have been really up and coming and have certainly made a big impact on the industry, both in pushing more and more towards cloud services, as well as becoming another option and a competitor to these other solutions that are more established. When you look at the other side, you see McKesson, Pathways, Meditech, and Healthland. Those are solutions that typically we're seeing being replaced as part of an ERP selection. In McKesson's case, Pathways is a solution that has not really progressed much in the last few years. And recently, McKesson sold Pathways along with a variety of other solutions to Allscripts. So that's now an Allscripts product, and the future of that solution is not entirely clear. Personally, I think that anybody who is on Pathways should be looking at what the alternatives are in the market, because my personal belief is that that product will not continue to be supported or developed, and that eventually there will be a sunset announcement on that product. So anybody who's on one of these older products may want to be considering what their next move is. SAP is obviously a huge ERP solution. They're actually the biggest ERP solution in the world. However, it is not commonly implemented in healthcare environments. It does work in healthcare environments, and there are some that use it, but it is a more expensive solution to implement and to maintain than many of the alternatives. And generally, where I do see SAP in healthcare is more with government hospitals, county hospitals, where they may be using SAP for the larger public sector organization, as opposed to being primarily about what was right for the hospital. And so that's another solution that you see out there, but is not, I wouldn't say commonly implemented, and not something that typically I see involved in the selection, though it has been in some cases. Another big consideration, and I would say overall, when you're looking at the different options that are out there in the market, key is to understand who the players are, understand who you want to bring to the table to be a part of your discussions. Also, one of the things that you're starting to see is more of a movement towards point solutions. There's some really amazing supply chain specific solutions, both on the requisition side, where you see options like Ariba and Coupa being common in electronic requisitions. There's supply chain solutions like there's a OR supply chain solution that does inventory management called Genesis that's recently come to the U.S. from commonly being used in Europe. So you are starting to see more point solutions filling gaps and providing more healthcare specific functionality for ERP around ERP products, because despite the fact that ERP is common in healthcare, there is not complete functionality for everything that healthcare wants, really, in any of these solutions. All of them are trying to get there, but all of these solutions that you're looking at, when you look at the left side, the big products that are commonly implemented, and certainly with SAP, these are solutions that are used in many, many industries. And as a result, they have to provide a very wide range of functionality, and they can't necessarily focus on healthcare. And as a result, you are starting to see some point solutions being very effective as additions to these solutions, or in some cases, for example, Workday is newer in the supply chain. So some people have financials and HR on Workday, but supply chain in a third-party product, such as that. Another common thing that you should be thinking about, and is talked about as part of these implementations, is whether or not to be on the cloud. And there are really three general variations here. The classic on-premise, you have the servers, and the software is sold to you as a license, and you pay an annual maintenance fee. It's the most commonly implemented model, and that's the traditional way to do it. What you've seen a trend towards in the last few years is two things. True cloud solutions, and Workday is probably the most pure example of this, though Oracle has Fusion now, and Infor now has a cloud product as well. But in those cases, they could be sold as a software as a service, where you're paying a monthly fee, or they could be sold as a license, perpetual license, and paying annual maintenance. But in those cases, basically, they're providing you with the whole environment, and everything is hosted back at the company's servers or a third party that they may happen to contract with. And then there's the option of hosted, which is essentially you have your own server, but it is hosted by somebody else. In that case, it would be a perpetual license that you're paying for. The benefits of a cloud solution generally include reduced maintenance costs. Upgrades are easier and often applied for you on a strict time frame. It does reduce the amount of effort that you have to do in supporting that application. And some of the disadvantages are is you have a little less control over the application. Workday, and a big portion of their success, has been in providing the same functionality for every customer. So what you've seen is a lot of people who have customizations that have developed over time have a harder time going to a cloud environment. So it is a more restrictive environment, And you could see that as a good thing, or you could see that as a bad thing, depending on your perspective. So it is an option. The other consideration with cloud that's important is the idea of operating versus capital dollars. So when you're making a traditional perpetual license purchase, that is clearly capital dollars. However, when you do a pure software as a service, increasingly auditors have been expecting that money would be considered operational. And whether you would rather have that being used as capital dollars or operational dollars depends on the specifics of your organization, but it may be a big factor in your ability to finance the project. So that's a consideration that you have to have as well when you're looking at cloud solutions, is would you prefer that it be capital or operating dollars that you're using for both the implementation and for the ongoing cost of the solution. So when you're looking at these options, the question comes up about, should I do a formal software selection? And when in some cases, people genuinely don't know what they want. In some cases, people think they know what they want, but they want to vet it out. In some cases, I've talked to people who know exactly what they want. And in one case in particular, I remember talking to a hospital who was looking at, who was going to be getting a new ERP solution. I was talking to them about it, and they said that they already made a decision on what they wanted, and they didn't need to do a software selection. And it was my advice to them to take a look at what was out in the marketplace and make sure they were making an informed decision, and that they were fully aware, and that their past experience with the solutions that were out there may not represent their current needs and may not represent the current state of those applications, and then suggested they need to look at it. But the bigger reason why I advise them to do that is because of the idea of buy-in. That we want to get, the big part of a selection process is engaging your staff and getting them excited about a solution. When you go to somebody and when you go to your departments and say, we're implementing this ERP solution and we've chosen to implement this particular option, and they had no opportunity to have a say in it, they're much more likely to be resistant to the idea. They're much more likely to find flaws in your decision than if they were engaged in a part of the decision to do it. So I'd often advise CIOs, CFOs who are looking at options to make sure that you're engaging your staff, give them the opportunity to provide feedback and to be a part of that decision so that everybody owns it, so that it's not purely one person's decision. I went to one organization where the previous decision was made to buy a particular solution. They were very unhappy with it, and nobody would take responsibility for having made the decision to go to that solution. Everybody's pointed to somebody else, and somebody else made the decision. You don't want to get in a situation where either everybody's pointing at you for having made the decision, or where nobody wants to take accountability for it. So what I believe is strongly structured decision processes where it's 100% clear who made that decision, who was involved, and what their role was in that decision. In doing so, makes them immediately engaged. So when we start up an implementation, they're ready to go, they know what they want, and they're excited about it. And that's really a key part of success. I should mention that the hospital that I worked with that told me they didn't need a selection, we ended up doing it, and they actually picked a different product than what they had originally intended to do. And I was told it was 100% sure what they wanted to do. When we went through the process, they were 100% sure that they wanted to go a different direction. And that is actually quite common as people look into the details of the applications that are out there and understand better what their needs really are. Part of that really gets into from a change management perspective. And I believe that software projects, EHR projects, ERP projects are more about change management than they are even about the technology. Because the technology solutions that are out there, you look at the ERP, you compare the functionality, they're all going to post to the general ledger. They're all going to do a lot of different things. They're all going to allow you to pay bills. And you won't find a smoking gun necessarily between the different solutions out there where you say, aha, I can only get this. Part of the purpose of a software selection process is to get people excited and get people involved and be a part of that change. And I love this particular cartoon because it shows what really happens in many organizations, that if you ask people, do you want to change what we have now, everybody wants to change. Nobody wants everything to stay the same, but when you tell them what the change is and how it's going to impact them, then nobody wants to change it more. So a big part of a success in any big project, doesn't have to be an ERP project, is doing the proper change management to get people excited, to get people energized behind the purpose of this project and the benefits that the organization is going to get out of it. And another way to look at that, I love this Woodrow Wilson quote, that if you want to make enemies, try to change something. So if you don't engage the staff, if you don't get in a situation where people feel that they all own it, then you're much more likely to be in an adversarial situation when the implementation starts. And I've seen that, and that's a lot of where implementations go bad, where maybe finance made the decision to choose a particular solution and HR wasn't involved and they're not happy with the solution. And as a result, we have an immediate adversarial situation the moment the implementation starts. And that makes it much harder for everyone to get what they want out of the project. So making sure that you provide an opportunity for everyone to engage, to participate in that process, to have a voice in that decision helps tremendously in starting that implementation off on the right foot. And we'll talk about that a little more as we're transitioning over into ramping up the implementation, how you can take advantage of having involved them in the selection process prior. And when I run a software selection, I'm always expecting that everybody's voice is going to be contributing, going to be a part of it, and on the record that we know what they said, what their recommendation was, so that it's clear who supported and who didn't later on if those questions come up. So when you're looking at structuring an ERP selection, there's a variety of ways to go about this, but just providing kind of a one view of how to do that. And the idea basically being that you should have a primary selection committee that includes a cross-section of leadership in the organization that's going to make the final decision about what product you're going to buy. But then you need additional committees who are going to dig into additional detail to understand better all the details of the functionality that the people on the primary selection committee maybe don't necessarily need to know about. The factors that go into the decision that you're going to make are going to include the more tactical, detailed functionality, as well as strategic questions such as, what's this vendor's position in the market? Do I trust them? Do I believe that they're going to be around to support my organization? Are they financially sound? There's different aspects of that go into that selection process. So the primary selection committee would be involved in looking at those more global elements of the solutions that you're considering, while the different committees would look at their more specific functionality. And in this representation, I have a finance committee. This would be an advisory committee of finance people who would be looking at the functionality in more depth, and then subcommittees, for example, for something like accounts payable, that would look deep into the accounts payable functionality, get hours of AP demos that the AP staff certainly cares about, and they want to have a voice in sharing how good or not good that functionality is, but that all the people in the finance committee may not necessarily need to see all that detail. But the idea of creating this hierarchy and this structure allows us to have multiple people involved at every layer and to provide that feedback and participate in this process and allow everyone to be at the right level where they need to be to understand the functionality and put the right amount of time into that selection. Similar concepts in supply chain and human resources. And then generally selections are going to involve a facilitator. I think having a facilitator, whether it's an internal or an external facilitator, is essential to a selection process in order for it to be successful. The facilitator has a variety of different roles, but somebody needs to be driving this process and help to make sure that everybody gets what they need out of it, and that everybody involved in the decision is actively engaged and able to get the information that they need. So when you look at the three different levels of this, the primary committee is determining what's best for the entire organization. So they're looking at the overall view of the solution. So they're going to understand the global pros and cons of the vendor, and they're going to make the final decision. So typically, what we see is they're going to be, when you start off a selection process, the vendors are going to come in and do an executive level presentation where they give a high level overview of their product. That's what the primary selection committee is going to see and what they're going to judge things by. Some of those primary selection committee members may also be on some of the advisory committees. So for example, if you're the CFO, Maybe you're going to be a part of the primary committee, but also part of the finance committee. And then the controller and some of your accounting staff would also be part of that advisory committee, and then additional layers of functionality be looked at in the subcommittees, which would involve the appropriate team members from there. The advisory committees are going to determine what's best for their particular function. And they're going to create that subcommittee structure to look at things in more detail in their area. And they're going to view higher level demonstrations of the functionality in that area. So they'll get maybe a half-day finance overview of the application where they look a lot at reports and they look at how the functionality all ties together, where then the subcommittees are then going to look into the much more detailed functionality, where they may spend an entire day looking at how accounts payable functions or how inventory control functions. And that allows everyone to fit in at the appropriate level and for you to involve a large number of different staff members in participating and analyzing and understanding this functionality, and to make sure you're giving everyone a voice. You're not always going to have the same opinions. The supply chain department may like something different than what the HR department has. But I find that in general, by putting this process together where everyone gets that voice, that consensus comes together and that people come together and find the right solution and the right answer for their particular organization. So the facilitator is a key part of that, basically to be the source of truth and to keep it moving, but also to be a contact point for the vendors. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the RFP process and how that fits in. But somebody needs to be the central point of contact for the vendor to make sure that everything's being done appropriately in the selection, and that the vendor is following up, and to reduce the amount of time that the other folks as subject matter experts need to spend following up on all the different details that you'll have in a selection process, including reference checks, including scheduling of demonstrations. And facilitation to me is a lot about leading discussion. So as a facilitator, a big portion of that is getting people in the room together and saying, okay, to the Finance Advisory Committee, you've now had the opportunity to see everything. Let's talk through what the pros were that you saw. Let's talk through what the cons were. Let's make a list of that. And let's work together to figure out what we liked and didn't like about each solution, and whether or not the things we didn't like are things we could live with, and establishing, waiting for that, and helping people to determine what they believe is the right answer. And keeping that process fair and balanced is a key component of that as well. And there's a lot of risk of things getting off track because of a vendor going outside of the selection process to influence people, which a facilitator can help to control. So when you look at the RFI process, a big portion of that, I think that in general, I'm going to start off by saying that generally I see organizations spend way too much time and money on the RFP and not enough time and money dealing with looking at and evaluating the applications. I generally prescribe to the concept of a LITE RFI. And the basic concept that this comes down to is the idea that when you're talking in an industry, there's only a couple of players that they know more about what you need from the software than you probably do. And they are in a position where they do demonstrations all the time to hospitals. They know what hospitals need. They have hundreds of hospital customers. And so I see this more as a question of, I'm going to present to you what our scenario is, what our situation is. We currently have this solution. It's being sunset. This is what our organization looks like. This is what's important to us in choosing a vendor. Come in and show us how you can solve our problems. So rather than going through an extensive line-by-line detail RFI, to instead present a scenario and ask the vendor to help you to understand how they can fix your problems, how they can make your life better. And an interesting example of that, I was involved in a RFI response with a software vendor, and the sales guy who was responding to it had this list of functions that we were supposed to be able to say that we did or not. And there were just like 500 line items on this thing. And we went to, actually got down selected and went to the meeting with the client. And they said, we were going through your RFI response, and we saw that there were many things that we wanted that you don't do. And so we're concerned about that. And the salesperson pulled out the RFI response, and he said, yes, I've seen these things that you listed here. And said, one of the things that you asked if we could do that we said no to was the ability to do a Japanese auction. And he said to the whole room full of people, does anybody here have any idea what a Japanese auction is? And it was complete blank stares. Nobody had any idea. And he said, I didn't know either. I had to look it up. And then he explains to everybody what it was. And he says, is there any reason your organization would ever use that functionality? And they said, no. And he said, well, did you have a consultant write this RFI for you? He said, yes. So maybe this isn't really a representation of what your needs are. And I think it's an important aspect of understanding that what you don't need is not a list of functionality. All those vendors that I showed you before, all are going to do 99% of the functionality that you need. Again, there's not going to be a smoking gun difference between a PeopleSoft or a Lawson. It's going to be more of understanding the references out there, where the organizations are going, and choosing what is the right fit for your organization. You're not going to find out that one of them won't print checks and the other one will. So it's less about the functionality and more about how they align with your vision and direction in the end. And that's why it's important to tell your story in an RFI and give them the chance to come in and explain how they can help you with that. And let them translate that into features for you rather than you prescribing what features you think you need. And that also leads into saving a whole lot of money in writing an RFI. I've seen people spend 6 months writing an RFI and hundreds of thousands of dollars with consulting firms to do that. That's not necessary. This can be done in weeks. It can be done with a very reasonable budget if you control that process and make sure this is about what's really important to you, which should be more about presenting your vision about where you want to take the hospital. Rules of the road are an important part of this too. You want to make sure that it's clear who they're going to work with and how they interact with people, whether or not they're allowed to do things like giveaways. I had one situation in an EHR selection process I was involved in where the vendor was secretly attempting to give the doctors private demos and give them CME credits if they attend the demonstrations, which was completely outside of our selection process, and we found out that they were doing it on the side. Things like that happen quite often. You want to make sure that people are making the honest and fair decision in this process, and having a facilitator and having clear rules of the road is a very important component of that. You want to make sure that that you decide things like, are they allowed to bring in lunch? Are they allowed to buy dinner? Are they allowed to give you tickets? All those things need to be established. I've worked with government hospitals where those reins are very tight, and I've worked with other organizations where it's much more open to interpretation. But part of your RFI should clearly explain what the rules of the selection are and establish the role of the facilitator in that process. When you're doing the demonstration, some of the things to look for, and this is something that's a big part of preparing people in a selection process, is prepping them on what you want to look for in demonstrations, what you want to ask in demonstrations. And just a few quick tips just to think about. First of all, are they able to anticipate your needs? That tells you a lot about whether or not they really understand your industry, about whether or not they are quick thinkers and able to solve problems. And that part of that is taking them off script. If they're following a very scripted demonstration, ask them to go off script. There was one demo that I was in where we found out that the vendor was faking doing a live demo on an iPad because somebody took them off script. And they made it look like they had iPad functionality when in actuality they were just flipping the slides on a PowerPoint, and they were hiding that. You'd be surprised how often things like that can happen. Do they challenge you to think differently is a key component. I think that bringing their ideas to the table about how your hospital could benefit and improve using the software is a great sign. Are they showing software that is generally available? Or are they insistent on showing you next year's product, which you may or may not get and may or may not ever get released? Generally, as part of a software selection, I put in rules that you can only show GA product without specifically calling it out and asking for permission. In some cases, we only allow you to show GA product, but those are questions to ask. Do they develop or acquire products? ERP is very acquisition intensive and very different than where you see where Epic is in the HR world. And as a result, you often see disconnected products being purchased by the same company, and then they try to tie them together. It makes a difference in the interoperability between them. So it's questions you want to ask and understand. Are they telling you or are they showing you? Especially when you're an executive level demo, you don't necessarily want to see a hour-long demonstration of how to enter in a GL entry, but you want to see what that functionality generally looks like. And maybe you want to focus more on reporting and other things. So just things you want to think about. And part of this is just, are these people you want to work with? And one thing that's, a small thing, but something I focus on a lot is how many people do they bring to the room? And what role does each person play in the process? I think it shows a lot of confidence when a software company can have one or two people demo a wide variety of products. If they need to have one person to demo every single one of 10 different modules to you, that's probably a sign that their software is too complicated for one person to learn a wide range of the functionality. So these are just things to think about as you're viewing those demonstrations. None of these are, again, guns or 100% tell you specifically that it's not going to work, that it's going to work, but they're things that you should be paying attention to and keeping a lookout for in those demonstrations. When you're looking at references, I actually had a situation in a selection a couple of years ago where the reference person they gave us actually worked for the software company and was on site there and had an email address for that particular hospital and was representing himself as a hospital employee. And I looked on LinkedIn and found out that he actually worked for the software company. It sounds crazy, but I've seen it all over the years. Make sure they're relevant references, and I dictate in RFIs what type of references we're looking for. There'd be a particular size hospital or a particular type of software in place. Call names they don't give you. Ask your peers, and make sure that you're asking the right kinds of questions. And generally, when it is not uncommon for somebody acting as a reference to get some kind of benefit from that vendor in doing so. So you want to make sure that you're getting a truly unbiased opinion. Ask leading questions to say, what would you have done differently? What was harder than you expected? What did you not implement and why? Lessons learned, and budget items too, because you're probably at the same time in parallel putting together your project budget. And certainly it's not uncommon for surprises to come up in implementations. And so what did you not anticipate that you had to add to the budget later? Again, just things to be thinking about as you're going through that process. A lot of people do scoring. Generally, I'm not a big fan of the scoring process because I think it takes away from ultimately the reality that it's gut instinct and that drives selections and decisions as opposed to scoring. And what I think is really the wrong way to do it is to have, if you do a scoring sheet, is to have a scoring sheet where everyone during the demonstration is sitting there with a piece of paper and writing down the scores while the vendor's doing a demonstration. That is somewhat disrespectful to the vendors who are there doing the demonstration, and it forces them to be thinking about what's on your piece of paper. I've seen vendors leaning over and looking at the piece of paper to see what is really important that they should be showing. In the end, you want to go off script. You want to see different things. You want to challenge them in different ways and really understand the scope of the applications. And I think scoring often can distract from that. I've done with scoring as well, so I'm not sort of saying it doesn't work, but in general, I tend to look at it more from the standpoint of conversations to talk about the pros and cons, and then determining the weight of those pros and cons, as opposed to a true scoring mechanism. Surveying is a big part of many selections that we do to get people's initial reactions and instinct, but in the end, I think that the people more so than anything else trust their guts when they make a decision. The decisions should be made at every level. So generally, I recommend the subcommittees making a recommendation to the advisory committees, and the advisory committees making a recommendation to the primary committee, which would then look at the whole thing and make a global decision for the organization. Again, it allows everyone to have the opportunity to have a voice, to express their concerns, to participate, and to be a part of that decision. And I recommend requiring that each of the committees put a written response together with exactly what their pros and cons were and what their opinions were, so that that's available to the primary committee as they make their decisions, as well as just available for prosperity. When it comes time to actually negotiate the deal, you know, there is the reality that often the timing is really important. If you catch vendors at the end of a month or a quarter or a fiscal year, it does tend to work out. You get better deals, and so sometimes that makes a difference and can factor in. I caution against overbuying, and I think I see this a lot in ERP where people buy modules that they never implement, and just make sure you honestly intend to implement everything. Sometimes things get thrown in a little bit at the end, you know, as part of a negotiation, but it's only valuable to you if you're actually going to implement it. And you also want to make sure you're not paying support on solutions that you are not implementing. So there's things to consider as you're going through. You want to make sure you look at the implementation costs. Traditionally with ERP vendors, there's options to go to third parties to do those implementations, either in whole or in part. And so you want to consider what's the right solution for you in terms of project management, change management, and implementation resources, which could include a role for the software vendor, but may not be all about just using the software vendor. So those are all considerations you want to factor in, and you can shop around those implementation costs and make sure that you're getting a good cost associated with that. You also want to be careful to make sure you're not looking at just cheapest price, because implementation resources are all about quality, and somebody could be cheaper per hour, but if they're not as good of a resource, they're going to spend more hours doing the same thing. So that isn't necessarily the solution, but part of that selection is choosing an implementation partner. Other things to consider from a budgetary standpoint: make sure you have an interface engine, you have interfaces factored into all of that. You need staffing, both internal and external, and there is typically going to be some internal staffing requirements associated, which you can fill either with internal people or with contracted staff augmentation. But you want to make sure you have enough internal people to have true ownership of that solution going forward. You might need to backfill some existing staff. A big component of what I see missed in ERP is master file prep. Your item file, your vendor file are going to require cleanup and augmentation. There's going to be data missing, and there's going to be duplicates that you've built up over time. Those types of files need attention, and that is probably the most commonly missed budget line item that I see in an ERP implementation budget. The hardware, obviously the computers for that, the training, including both generally the ERP vendors provide a more train the trainer kind of approach. To have really effective training programs, I believe it's really important to the long-term success of a product that you have great training that's highly organized, that's taught by highly experienced and effective trainers who know how not only to use that product, but are good adult educators. So it's all part of what you want to consider and make sure that you're factoring in building custom training materials that fit your organization, that include your processes, and that you have enough training factored in to cover your organization, both for the implementation and then post-go live. And then other third-party solutions and servers and other things that need to be considered. And any of these topics, you know, look at this, and I could probably spend an hour just talking about how to budget for an ERP implementation, and maybe we'll do that another time. But all things that you just want to be thinking about as you're going through this process. Preparing the team for the implementation, I strongly believe in the power of creating a strong team, including both internal and external resources, that is taught how to work together and to be an effective organization. And what I do as part of those implementations typically is provide a lot of team building and education to them about how they need to work together. What happens in a lot of implementations is they get siloed, where you have the HR department going off and doing their own thing, and the AP department doing something else, and the two don't mesh together well. You find you have discrepancies. Invoice matching is a common area where you could have supply chain and accounts payable going in different directions, and you don't have two compatible solutions. It's important that people are working together. I also see implementations where it's an IT department that goes off in another building, builds everything, shows it to the end users, and it's not what the end users want. They need to be a part of that implementation. And so I strongly believe in creating teams that include a representation from those functions within the hospitals, as well as people who are going to be involved in the long-term maintenance of those solutions. This is just an example of some of the kinds of things that I do typically in these sessions of getting the team prepared, is to make sure that they have everything, that they really understand how to work together to be an effective organization, including doing disc profiling, doing team exercises, and teaching them concepts from many different business books that I found really help to build a strong team. And then when you look at preparing the organization for the change, just quickly, that rumor control is a big component of running a good project. It's important to have a clear communication, clear vision, and to make sure that the organization has opportunities to ask questions and respond to all their questions. So as the word gets out about the project, you want to control that messaging. You want to make sure that people understand what that project's all about. And communication, constantly doing town halls, doing newsletters, those components make a big difference in getting the staff as a whole behind the organization and behind the change. So that's a key component of a successful project. And again, something that that could spend a lot more time on in a future discussion or presentation. And lastly, mention that when you're looking at a project, there's going to be areas where you're going to need help. And what exactly the areas that you need help on might depend on your particular skill sets and your particular staffing, but everybody needs some level of assistance on these projects. Things to think about: how you're going to handle the project management, change management, which often is overlooked, and I would say is a critical component of a successful project. You want to make sure they're bringing leading practices to the table, have experienced people with the application, as well as trainers, people to support the go live to help to make sure it's successful. You will need extra people at a go live beyond what's standard on your implementation team, and having the right number of people there can make a big difference. And then also, if you are struggling along the way, often I've been brought in as more of an implementation rescue team or doing post-implementation audits to help to improve the results of a implementation that is going poorly or did go poorly, and there's a desire to turn that around. So as you're thinking about the budgeting and the components of what you have available, think beyond just the question of the resources provided by the software vendor to teach you how to use the application, but also be thinking about all the other aspects about how you're going to manage that change and make sure you get a quality product out there within the organization. All right, I think I'm closing in on the time here, so I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. Put my contact information here, as well as a blog where I contribute to regularly and share different thoughts about different solutions, including ERP and EHR solutions. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up for a couple of minutes of questions.
Brian, thank you very much. This is very informative and very interesting. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask, if you could please put them in the questions section of the panel to your right, we'd be happy to answer any of those for you. At this time, we don't have any, so I'll just give it a couple of minutes and to see if somebody wishes to ask any questions.
This question here: do you see these driven more by CFOs or CIOs in healthcare? I think that in the ERP side, I think it's probably a little bit more on the CIO side, but I see increasingly CFOs and COOs driving projects. Supply chain savings is a critical objective of many ERP implementations, and that is usually very important to the finances of the organization. And as a result, that often the CIO may be not necessarily the instigator, the CFO or the CEO may be the instigator of the change, and the CEO might be driving it, but I've seen others which are entirely controlled within the operations and with their operational teams. And that's why I think it's very important that it be a marriage between the operational side of the organization and the information technology side. If only one's driving it, it's not as likely to be successful. couple requests for the slides, and certainly we'll send those out at the end of the meeting.
Yeah, we'll get those sent out. Another question here about when I get that bargain hunting for a 200-bed hospital, what vendors best fit from solely a cost perspective?
A cost perspective is hard to answer, honestly, because it varies a lot. The timing issue is important in that, and I've seen huge variations in pricing, much more so on ERP than I do on EHR, where the price last year doesn't necessarily reflect the price this year. It comes down to more how much they want in your business right now. So I'd say you got to shop it to determine. But you know, for a 200-bed hospital, you're going to want to be looking at the players on the left side that I mentioned. The Lawson Oracle products and Workday are going to be the three most common that people are implementing right now. And it used to be that at a 200 beds, it would be harder to have those solutions be cost effective, but that has changed significantly in the last few years.
Great, thank you for that answer. Can we have any more questions out there for Brian?
And one more comment, I guess I'll mention on that, just that you want to make sure that you're looking at the future, in that if you do implement a solution that is a lower price, that doesn't have as much of a future, you're much more likely to be in a position a few years down the line where you have to replace it. So you want to make sure you're looking at the longevity.
Great, and we did get another question. Hospital has Meditech as an EHR. Can it be assumed that they have the Meditech ERP as well?
Not a lot of the older Meditech implementations have Meditech ERP, but not everybody purchased and implemented the ERP products, and a lot of those ERP products have been replaced. I'm not seeing a lot of Meditech ERP implementations any longer that generally are more being replaced by the other solutions. Okay, were there any other questions?
Yeah, we had one more here. How do you deal with enemies when you are trying to make a change to their system? For instance, when changing from Allscripts to Epics.
So, how do you deal with enemies during implementation? I think that you know, to a large extent, I've been very successful through change management in getting those folks on board. You know, there's a concept in change management that you're always going to have. You're going to have early adopters and you're going to have resistors, people who will be resistant. Generally, what you look for is to get a group of those resistors together and turn them around. Take the ones that can be turned around and get them on board. And then eventually, if there's somebody who just flat out is never going to accept change, and there's someone that was in every implementation, then you might not be able to get them to that point. And organizations lose people as a result of those changes sometimes. But if you can take early adopters, get them excited about it, and take other people who are on the fence and get them excited, then they help you to turn around other people through the process. I absolutely, regardless though, I believe in giving everyone a voice in the process, in the software selection, in the implementation. Let them vet their concerns and address them as best you can. But in the end, you can't make everybody happy.
Great. Brian, thank you very much for this fantastic presentation today. I appreciate that. We don't have any more questions, so we appreciate everybody joining the webinar today. We hope you found it interesting and educational, and please be sure to follow Optimum Healthcare IT on social media, where we share lots of ERP content, and look out for our next webinar to be sometime during Q2. Thank you much, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you.